Gene Simmons stood in the doorway of the rehearsal space, arms crossed, watching Ace Frehley tune his guitar. The rest of the band had left an hour ago. Just the two of them remained in the cramped room that smelled of cigarette smoke and amplifier dust. Gene had been waiting for this moment, had planned this conversation for weeks, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, almost friendly. But the words cut like broken glass. "You know what your problem is, Ace? You're not rock star material. You never will be." Ace's fingers froze on the tuning pegs. He didn't look up, didn't respond. Just sat there, holding his guitar, processing what he'd just heard. Gene continued, stepping further into the room. "You're a good guitar player. Nobody's arguing that. But being in a successful band requires more than just playing your instrument. It requires charisma, stage presence, business sense, drive. You don't have those things. You're just a guy who plays guitar." That's not enough. For 5 seconds, the room was completely silent. Then Ace set down his guitar, stood up, and did something that would change the dynamic of Kiss forever. He proved Gene Simmons wrong in a way that nobody, least of all Gene himself, ever expected. It was early 1977, and Kiss was transitioning from successful rock band to global phenomenon. The makeup was working, the theatrics were selling tickets, and the merchandising was generating revenue beyond what anyone had predicted. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, the band's co-founders and primary business minds, were steering the ship with ruthless efficiency. They controlled the songwriting, the image, the interviews, the direction. They made the decisions. Peter Criss and Ace Frehley were employees as much as they were band members. Talented employees, essential employees, but employees nonetheless. And Gene, in particular, had started to view them that way. Peter was emotional, difficult, prone to outbursts. Ace was quiet, passive, content to let others make decisions as long as he could play his guitar. Neither of them had the killer instinct that Gene believed was necessary to dominate the music industry. Neither of them were natural leaders, and in Gene's worldview, if you weren't a leader, you were expendable. The tension had been building for months. Kiss had just come off their most successful tour to date, the Destroyer Tour, which had cemented their status as arena headliners. But with success came pressure, expectations, and an increased workload that was starting to fracture the band's unity. Gene and Paul were constantly in meetings with management, lawyers, merchandising companies. They were building an empire. Peter and Ace were showing up for rehearsals and shows, but weren't involved in the business side. Gene saw this as a lack of commitment. Ace saw it as staying in his lane, doing what he was hired to do. The philosophical difference was creating a divide that was becoming harder to ignore. Gene believed everyone should be hustling constantly, always thinking about the next move, the next opportunity. Ace believed his job was to write good guitar parts and play them well on stage. Everything else was someone else's responsibility. That divide came to a head on a Tuesday night in March 1977. The band had been rehearsing new material for what would become the Love Gun album. Paul and Peter had already left the studio. Gene had hung back, telling Ace he wanted to discuss some guitar parts. But that was a lie. Gene didn't want to discuss guitar parts. He wanted to have the conversation he'd been rehearsing in his head for weeks. The conversation about hierarchy, about who was essential and who was replaceable, about what it really took to be a rock star. He'd chosen to have this conversation alone with Ace because he knew Ace wouldn't fight back. Ace never fought back. He just absorbed the criticism, maybe nod, maybe look hurt, but ultimately accept whatever Gene said. That's who Ace was. Passive, agreeable, not a threat. Gene started diplomatically, or what he considered diplomatic. He talked about the band's trajectory, about the opportunities ahead, about the importance of everyone being fully committed. Ace listened, still holding his guitar, nodding occasionally. Then Gene shifted. He started talking about what separated successful musicians from legends. Legends had presence, had vision, had the ability to command attention even when they weren't performing. They were brands, personalities, forces. Ace, according to Gene, was none of those things. Ace was talented, sure. His guitar solos were good, sometimes great. His songwriting contributions were solid, but he didn't have that indefinable quality that made someone a star. He was support, not center stage, a role player, not a leader. And in Gene's assessment, delivered with the blunt certainty of someone who believed he was helping, Ace would never be more than that. You're not rock star material. You never will be. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ace's first instinct was to agree, to internalize the criticism the way he always did, to believe that Gene was probably right. Gene was the smart one, the business guy, the one who understood how the industry worked. If Gene said Ace wasn't rock star material, it was probably true. Ace had never seen himself as a star anyway. He'd grown up in the Bronx, teaching himself guitar because he loved the instrument, joining bands because he wanted to play music. The fame, the makeup, the theatrical performances, those were all surprises, things that had happened to him, rather than things he'd planned. Maybe Gene was right. Maybe Ace was just a guitar player, nothing more. But then something else happened, something unexpected. Instead of accepting Gene's assessment, instead of shrinking back and nodding along, Ace felt anger. Real anger, the kind he rarely allowed himself to feel. Because Gene wasn't just critiquing his business sense or his stage presence. Gene was diminishing everything Ace brought to Kiss, reducing him to a replaceable component in a machine. Ace set his guitar down carefully, almost gently. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. Gene, who'd been expecting capitulation or maybe hurt silence, suddenly looked uncertain. Ace walked to the corner where his guitar cases were stacked, opened one, and pulled out a different instrument. A Les Paul, sunburst finish, the guitar he'd used to audition for Kiss 4 years earlier. The guitar that had gotten him this job in the first place. He plugged it into the amp that was still warm from rehearsal, adjusted the volume, and turned to face Gene. "You want to know if I'm rock star material?" Ace said quietly. "Let me show you what you'd be replacing." And then he started to play. What came out of that amplifier wasn't just technically impressive. It was emotionally devastating. Ace played a melody that he'd been working on for weeks, something he'd never shown the band because it didn't fit the Kiss formula. It was bluesy, soulful, built on bends and vibrato, rather than speed and flash. Every note meant something. Every phrase told a story. This wasn't showmanship. This was artistry. This was a guitarist operating at a level that transcended technical skill and entered the realm of genuine emotional expression. Gene, who'd been standing near the door ready to leave after delivering his assessment, found himself frozen, listening. Ace played for maybe 2 minutes, building the melody, adding layers, letting the guitar sing in ways that had nothing to do with pyrotechnics or gimmicks. And when he finished, when the last note faded into silence, he looked at Gene with an expression that wasn't anger or hurt. It was certainty. "That's what you'd be replacing," Ace said again. "Not just a guy who plays guitar solos during the set. Someone who actually understands what this instrument can do, what it can make people feel. You and Paul, you're great at the business. You're great at building the brand, selling the image, making Kiss into something bigger than just 4 musicians. I respect that. I couldn't do what you do. But you couldn't do what I do either. You need someone who can make people feel something when they hear a guitar. That's my job. That's what I bring. And if you don't think that's rock star material, then you're not listening." Gene opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. For the first time in perhaps the entire history of their relationship, Gene Simmons didn't have a comeback. Because Ace was right. Absolutely, undeniably right. The moment stretched out, uncomfortable and transformative. Gene had entered this room believing he was the indispensable one, the visionary who kept Kiss functioning. He was walking out realizing that maybe, just maybe, he'd misjudged the quiet guy with the guitar. Ace wasn't passive because he lacked confidence. He was passive because he didn't need to prove himself constantly. His guitar did the talking. His contributions to the band's sound were so fundamental that removing him would fundamentally alter what Kiss was. Gene had been so focused on image, merchandising, business strategy that he'd forgotten what actually made Kiss worth merchandising in the first place: the music, the performance, the talent. And Ace had more pure musical talent in his fingertips than Gene could ever hope to possess. That realization was humbling in a way Gene rarely experienced. "Okay," Gene said finally, his voice lacking its usual certainty. "Point taken." Ace nodded, unplugged his guitar, packed it away. He didn't gloat, didn't push the advantage. That wasn't his style. He'd made his point, proven his worth, and that was enough. But the dynamic had shifted. Gene left the rehearsal space that night with a new understanding. Ace Frehley might not be a rock star in the traditional Gene Simmons definition, someone who courted attention and built a public persona and hustled for opportunities. But Ace was a rock star where it mattered most: on the instrument, in the music, in the ability to create something that moved people. And that was a kind of star power that couldn't be taught, bought, or replicated. You either had it or you didn't. Ace had it. The immediate aftermath of that confrontation was subtle but significant. Gene didn't apologize. That wasn't in his nature, but his behavior toward Ace changed. The dismissive comments stopped. The casual undermining in meetings ceased. When decisions were being made about guitar parts or solos, Gene started deferring to Ace's judgment rather than overruling him. Paul Stanley noticed the shift, asked Gene about it privately. Gene's explanation was characteristically blunt. "I underestimated him. I won't make that mistake again." Paul understood immediately. He'd never made the same mistake Gene had, because Paul, as a fellow musician, understood what Ace brought to the band. But watching Gene come to that realization was satisfying in its own way. It meant the internal dynamic of Kiss was becoming more balanced, less autocratic. Gene and Paul still ran the business side, still made the big strategic decisions. But when it came to the music, to the actual performance and artistry that everything else was built on, Ace and Peter had earned their seat at the table. The shift became public in small ways. In interviews, Gene started acknowledging Ace's contributions more explicitly, crediting him not just as a guitar player, but as a crucial element of Kiss's sound. When the band was photographed or filmed, Gene stopped positioning himself as the sole focal point and made space for Ace to be featured more prominently. During live shows, when Ace would launch into his guitar solos, Gene would step back and watch with what appeared to be genuine appreciation rather than impatience to get back to his own spotlight. These were minor adjustments, barely noticeable to outsiders, but within the band, they signaled a fundamental change in how Gene viewed Ace. Not as a hired gun who could be replaced, but as an essential partner who brought something irreplaceable to the collaboration. Ace, characteristically, didn't make a big deal out of any of this. He continued doing exactly what he'd always done, showing up for rehearsals, writing his parts, playing his solos, staying out of the business meetings. But there was a subtle confidence in how he carried himself now, a quiet certainty that he hadn't possessed before. He knew his worth. Gene had challenged it, and Ace had proven it beyond any doubt. That knowledge was armor against future criticism, insurance against being diminished or dismissed. When Gene or Paul would get overbearing or controlling, Ace could mentally return to that rehearsal room, to that moment when his guitar had said everything words couldn't. And remember that he belonged in this band, not because Gene allowed it, but because Kiss needed what he brought. The Love Gun album, released later that year, showcased this evolved dynamic. Ace contributed more songs than he had on previous albums, including Shock Me, which featured him on lead vocals. It was a showcase for his guitar work and his personal style in a way that previous Kiss albums hadn't allowed. Gene and Paul supported it, promoted it, gave Ace the space to be more than just the guitar player. The song became a fan favorite, a highlight of live shows, proof that Ace Frehley wasn't just contributing to Kiss's success, but was, in some ways, defining it. The solo on Shock Me became iconic, one of the most recognizable guitar moments in 70s rock. And every time Ace played it, every time the crowd erupted during those notes, it was vindication, not rock star material. The phrase seemed absurd in retrospect. The 1978 solo albums made the point even more definitively. When Casablanca Records decided that all 4 Kiss members would release solo albums simultaneously, it was seen as a marketing gimmick, a way to saturate the market and maximize profits. Gene's album was expected to be the big seller because of his public profile. Paul's album was expected to do well because of his songwriting. Peter's album was a wild card, and Ace's album, according to industry predictions, would be the weakest commercial performer because Ace didn't have the personality or the fan base to drive sales on his own. Those predictions were spectacularly wrong. Ace's solo album, powered by the hit single New York Groove, outsold the other 3. It reached number 13 on the Billboard charts. The single became a radio staple, still played on classic rock stations decades later. Ace Frehley, the guy who supposedly wasn't rock star material, had created the most commercially successful and critically acclaimed solo project of all 4 band members. Gene's reaction to this was complicated. Publicly, he congratulated Ace, praised the album in interviews, positioned it as a win for the Kiss brand overall. Privately, he was forced to confront just how wrong he'd been in his assessment. Ace wasn't just a talented guitar player. He was a legitimate solo artist, someone who could succeed outside the Kiss machinery based purely on his musical ability and instincts. That reality was humbling for Gene, who'd built his entire identity on being the smartest guy in every room, the one who understood the business better than anyone else. He'd misjudged Ace fundamentally, and the commercial success of the solo album was proof that his judgment, usually so reliable, had failed him completely. Years later, in the 90s and 2000s, when Gene and Ace would do interviews together or separately discussing Kiss history, that rehearsal room confrontation became part of the band's lore. Gene would reference it, usually framing it as a moment when he pushed Ace and Ace rose to the challenge. Ace would tell the story more bluntly. Gene told me I wasn't rock star material. I proved him wrong. The difference in how they told the story reflected the difference in their personalities. Gene needed to position himself as the catalyst, the tough love motivator who'd helped Ace find his confidence. Ace just stated the facts. Gene doubted him. Ace proved himself. End of story. The truth was probably somewhere in between, but the outcome was undeniable. That night in the rehearsal space changed their relationship permanently, creating a mutual respect that survived decades of conflict, breakups, reunions, and all the chaos that came with being in Kiss. The lesson from that confrontation extends beyond just Gene and Ace, beyond just Kiss. It speaks to a broader truth about talent, leadership, and the danger of confusing visibility with value. Gene Simmons was visible, vocal, aggressive in promoting himself in the band. That visibility made him seem essential, irreplaceable. Ace Frehley was quiet, reserved, content to stay in the background. That invisibility made him seem replaceable, less important. But when forced to demonstrate his value, when challenged to prove that he was more than just a session player, Ace revealed something Gene had overlooked. The quiet ones often have the deepest wells of talent. The ones who don't need constant validation are sometimes the most secure in their abilities, and someone who lets their work speak for itself is often doing better work than someone who won't shut up about how good they are. Today, both Gene Simmons and Ace Frehley are in their 70s. Kiss finally retired from touring in 2023 after a 50-year career that made them one of the best-selling bands in music history. The merchandise empire Gene built is worth hundreds of millions. The music Ace helped create continues to inspire new generations of guitarists, and when people talk about what made Kiss special, they talk about the combination. Gene's business acumen and theatrical instincts, Paul's songwriting and showmanship, Peter's drums, and Ace's guitar, the sound that turned good songs into great ones. The solos that made people's hearts race, the tone that was instantly recognizable from the first note. You can't build an empire without someone who understands business, but you also can't build an empire worth building without someone who understands soul. Gene was the business. Ace was the soul. And that night in the rehearsal room was when they both figured out that they needed each other more than either wanted to admit. The final word on whether Ace Frehley is rock star material came not from Gene, not from critics, not from sales figures. It came from the fans. Generations who wore Space Ace makeup, who learned guitar because they heard Ace play, who can still hum his solos decades later. Those fans didn't care about business sense or media savvy. They cared about one thing. Does this person make me feel something when they play? And the answer for millions across 50 years was yes. That's rock star material. That's the only definition that matters.